Chapter 4, Part 2. The man seemed to understand that it was no time for greetings, and without offering to enter the enclosure, climbed on top of the big gate where he sat, with one leg over the topmost bar, an interested spectator. The maneuvers of the black brought Phil to that side of the corral, and as he coolly dodged the fighting horse, he glanced up with his boyish smile and a quick nod of welcome to the man that was perched above him. The stranger smiled in return, but did not speak. He must have thought, though, that this cowboy appeared quite different from the picturesque rider he had seen at the celebration and on the summit of the divide. That Phil Acton had been, as the cowboy himself would have said, all togged out in his glad rags. This man wore chaps that were old and patched from hard service. His shirt, unbuttoned at the throat, was the color of the corral dirt, and a generous tear revealed one muscular shoulder. His hat was greasy and battered, his face grim and streaked with dust and sweat, but his sunny, boyish smile would have identified Phil in any garb. When the rider was ready to mount, and Bob went to open the gate, the stranger climbed down and drew a little aside. And when Phil passed where he stood, looked laughingly down at him from the back of the bucking, plunging horse, he made as if to applaud, but checked himself, and went quickly to the top of the knoll to watch the riders until they disappeared over the ridge. "Howdy. Fine weather we're having." It was the Dean's hearty voice. He had gone forward courteously to greet the stranger while the latter was watching the riders. The man turned impulsively, his face lighting with enthusiasm. "By Jove," he exclaimed, "but that man can ride." "Yes, Phil does pretty well," returned the Dean indifferently. "He won the championship at Prescott the other day." And then, more heartily, "He's a good boy, too. Take him any way you like." As he spoke, the cattleman looked the stranger over critically, much as though he would have a steer or a horse, noting the long limbs, the well-made body, the strong face, and clear, dark eyes. The man's dress told the Dean simply that the stranger was from the city. His bearing commanded the older man's respect. The stranger's next statement, as he looked thoughtfully over the wide land of valley and hill, mesa, and mountain, convinced the Dean that he was a man of judgment. "Arizona's wonderful country, sir. It's wonderful." "Finest in the world, sir," agreed the Dean promptly. "There just naturally ain't any better. We got the climate, we got the land, and we got the men." The stranger looked at the Dean quickly when he said men. It was worth much to hear the Dean speak that word. "Indeed you have," he said heartily. "I have never seen such men." "Of course you haven't," said the Dean. I tell you, sir, they just don't make 'em outside Arizona. It takes a country like this to produce real men. A man's got to be a man out here. Of course, though," he admitted kindly, "we don't know much except to ride and throw a rope, shoot maybe once in a while." The riders were returning, and the Dean and the stranger walked back down the little hill to the corral. "You have a fine ranch here, Mr. Baldwin," again the observated stranger said. The Dean glanced at him sharply. Many men have tried to buy the Cross Triangle. This man certainly appeared prosperous enough, though he was walking, but there was no accounting for the queer things that city men would do. "It does pretty well," the cattleman admitted. "I manage to make a living." The other smiled as though slightly embarrassed, and then, "Do you need any help?" "Help?" The Dean looked at him amazed. "I mean, I'd like a position to work for you, you know." The Dean was speechless. Again he surveyed the stranger with his measuring critical look. "You've never done any work," he said gently. The man stood very straight before him and spoke almost defiantly. "No, I haven't, but is that any reason why I shouldn't?" The Dean's eyes twinkled, as though they have a way of doing when you say something he liked. "I'd say it's a better reason why you should," he returned quietly. Then he said to Phil, who had dismissed his four-legged pupil, was coming towards him. "Phil, this man wants a job. Do you think we could use him?" The young man looked at the stranger with unfeigned surprise and a hint of amusement, but gave no sign that he had ever seen him before. The same natural decency of feeling that had prevented the cowboy from discussing the man upon whose privacy he felt he had intruded that evening of their meeting on the divide led him now to ignore the incident, a consideration which could not but command the strange man's respect, and from which he looked his gratitude. There was something about this stranger, too, that to Phil seemed different. This tall, well-built fellow, who stood before them so self-possessed and ready for anything, was not altogether like the uncertain, embarrassed, and half-frightened, troubled gentleman at whom Phil had first laughed when that thinly veiled contempt and then had been pitied. It was as though the man who sat that night alone on the divide had, out of the very bitterness of that experience, called forth from within himself a strength of which, until then, he had only been dimly cautious. There was now in his face and bearing courage and decision and purpose, and with it all the glint of the same humor that made him so bitterly mock himself. The dean's philosophy, touching the possibilities of the man who laughs when he is hurt, seemed in this stranger about to be justified. Phil felt oddly, too, that the man was in a way experimenting with himself, testing himself, as it were, and being altogether a normal human. The cowboy felt strongly inclined to help the experimenter. In this spirit he answered the dean, while looking mischievously at the stranger. "We could use him if he can ride." The stranger smiled understandingly. "Well, I don't see why I couldn't," he returned in that droll tone. "I seem to have legs." He looked down at his lower limbs reflectively, as though quaintly considering them to be apart from himself. Phil laughed. "Huh," said the dean, slightly mystified at the apparent understanding between the young men. And then to the stranger, "What do you want to work for? You don't look as though you need to. A sort of vacation?" There was spirit in the man's answer. "I want to work for the reason that all men want to work. If you do not employ me, I'll try somewhere else." "You come from Prescott to Simmons on the stage, did you?" "No, sir. I walked." "Walked? Huh. Try anything else for a job?" "No, sir." "Who sent you out here?" The stranger smiled. "I saw Mr. Acton ride in the contest, and I learned that he was foreman of the Cross Triangle Ranch. I thought I would rather work where he worked if I could." The dean looked at Phil. Phil looked at the dean. Together they looked at the stranger. The two cowboys who were sitting on their horses nearby grinned at each other. "And what's your name, sir?" the dean asked courteously. For the first time the man hesitated and seemed embarrassed. He looked uneasily about with a helpless inquiring glance, as though appealing for some suggestion. "Oh, never mind your name, if you've forgotten it," said the dean dryly. The stranger's roaming eyes fell upon Phil's old chaps, and then in every wrinkle and scar and rip and tear gave such a testimony to the wearer's life. In that curious, self-mocking smile touched his lips, and then, throwing up his head, looked the dean straight in the eye. He said boldly, but with that note of a droll humor in his voice, "My name is Patches, sir. Honorable Patches." The dean's eyes twinkled, but his face was grave. Phil's face flushed. He had not failed to identify the source of the stranger's inspiration, but before either the dean or Phil could speak, a shout of laughter came from Curly Elson, and the stranger had turned to face the cowboy. "Seems something amused you," he said quietly to the man on the horse, and at the tone of his voice, Phil, and the Dean exchanged significant glances. The grinning cowboy looked down at the stranger in evident contempt. "Patches," he drawled. "Honorable Patches. That's a hell of a name now, ain't it?" The man took 2 long steps forward towards the mocking rider and spoke quietly but with unmistakable meaning. "I'll endeavor to make it all of that to you, if you'll get off your horse." The grinning cowboy, with a wink at his companion, dismounted cheerfully. Curly Elson was held to be the best man with his hands in Yapia County. He could not refuse so tempting an opportunity to add to his well-earned reputation. 5 minutes later, Curly lifted himself on one elbow to the corral dust and looked up with respectful admiration to the quiet man who stood waiting for him to rise. Curly's lip was bleeding generously, and the side of his face seemed to have slipped out of place, and his left eye was closing surely and rapidly. "Get up," said the tall man calmly. "There's more where that came from, if you would like it." The cowboy grinned painfully. "Well, I don't seem to be hankering for any more," he mumbled, feeling his face tenderly. "I said that my name was Patches," suggested the stranger. "Sure, Mr. Patches, I reckon no one'll question that." "Honorable Patches," again prompted the stranger. Yes, sir, you bet. Honorable Patches," agreed Curly with emphasis. And then, as he painfully regained his feet, he held out his hand with as near a smile as his battered features would permit. "Do you mind shaking on it, Mr. Honorable Patches, just to show there's no hard feelings?" Patches responded instantly with a manner that won Curly's heart. "Good," he said. "I knew you would do that when you understood, or I wouldn't have bothered to show you my credentials." "My mistake," returned Curly. "It's them there credentials of yourn, not your name, that's hell." He gingerly mounted his horse again, and Patches turned back to the Dean as though apologizing for the interruption. "I beg your pardon, sir, but about the work?" The Dean never told anyone just what his thoughts were at that particular moment, probably because they were so many and so contradictory and confusing. Where from this uncertainty of mind, from a habit of depending upon his young foreman, or because of that something which Phil and the stranger seemed to have in common, he shifted the whole matter by saying, "It's up to Phil here. He's foreman on the cross triangle. If he wants to hire you, it's all right with me." At this, the 2 young men faced each other, and on the face of each other was a half-questioning, half-challenging smile. The stranger seemed to say, "I know I'm at your mercy, and I don't expect you to believe me after our meeting at the Divide, but I dare you to put me to the test." And Phil, if he had spoken, might have said, "I felt when I met you first there was a man somewhere around. I know you're curious to see what you can do if you're put to that test, and I'm curious too, and I'll give you the chance." Aloud, he reminded the stranger pointedly, "I said we might use you if you could ride." Patches smiled his self-mocking smile, evidently appreciating his predicament. "And I said," he retorted, "that I didn't see why I couldn't." Phil turned to his grinning but respectful helpers. "Bring out that bay with the blazed face." "Great snakes," ejected Curly to Bill, as they reached the gate leading to the corral. "His name's Patches, all right, but he'll be in pieces when that bay devil gets through with him if he can't ride. Do you think he can?" "I don't know," returned Bob as he unlatched the gate without dismounting. "I thought he couldn't fight." "So did I," returned Curly, grimly nursing his battered face. "You cut out that horse, I can't more'n half see." It was no trouble cutting out the bay. The big horse seemed to understand that his time had come. All day he had seen his mates go forth to their testing, had watched them as they fought with all their strength, the skill and endurance of that smiling boy-faced man, and then had seen them as they returned, sweating, trembling, conquered, and subdued. As Bob rode towards them, He stood for one defiant moment as motionless as a horse of bronze, and then, with a suddenness that gave Curly at the gate barely enough time to dodge his rush, he leaped forward into the large arena. Phil was watching the stranger as the big horse came through the gate. The man did not move, but his eyes were glowing darkly, his face was flushed, and he was smiling to himself mockingly as though amused at the thought about what was about to happen to him. The dean also was watching Patches, and again the young foreman and his employer exchanged significant glances as Phil turned and went quickly to little Billy. Lifting the lad from his saddle and seating him on the fence above the long watering trough, he said, "That's a grand stand there for you, partner. Don't get down unless you have to, and if you do, get down outside, you see." At that moment, yells of warning with a "Look out, Phil!" came from Curly, Bob, and the dean. A quick look over his shoulder, and Phil saw the big horse with ears wickedly flat and eyes a-gleaming, teeth bared, making straight in his direction. The animal had apparently singled him out as the author of his misfortunes, and proposed to dispose of his arch-enemy at the very outset of the battle. There was only one sane thing to do, and Phil did it. A vigorous, scrambling leap placed him beside little Billy and on top of the fence outside the watering trough. "Good thing I reserved a seat on your grandstand for myself, wasn't it, partner?" He smiled at the boy by his side. Then Bob's reator fell true, and as the powerful horse plunged and fought that strangling noose, Phil came leisurely down from the fence. "Where are you going, Phil?" chuckled the dean. "You sure aren't wasting any time," laughed Curly, and Bob, without taking his eyes from the vicious animal at the end of his tight rope, worked skillfully with his trained cow horse to foil every wicked plunge and wild leap, grinning with anticipation as he added, "I'd bet 4 bits you can't do it again, Phil, without a running start." "Well, I just thought I'd keep little Billy company for a spell," smiled Phil. He was sort of lonesome up here." The stranger, at first amazed that they could turn into a jest an incident which so easily could have been tragedy, suddenly laughed aloud, a joyous ringing laugh that made Phil look at him sharply. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Acton," said Patches meekly, but with that droll voice which brought a glint of humour into the foreman's eyes and called forth another chuckle from the dean. "You can take my saddle," said Phil pointedly. "It's over there at the end of the watering trough. You'll find the stirrups about right, I reckon. I ride with 'em a little long." For a moment the stranger looked him straight in the eyes, and then, without a word, started for the saddle. He was halfway to the end of the watering trough when Phil overtook him. "I believe I'd rather saddle him myself," the cowboy explained quietly with a sunny smile. You see, I got to teach these horses some cow sense before fall rodeo, and I'm rather particular about the way they're handled at the start." "Oh, exactly," returned Patches. "I don't blame you. That fellow seems rather to demand careful treatment, doesn't he?" Phil laughed. "Oh, you needn't be too particular about his feelings once you're up in the middle of 'em." The big bay, instead of acquiring sense from his observation, as Phil had expressed to the dean a hope that he would, seemed to have gained courage and determination. Phil's approach was the signal for a wild plunge in the young man's direction, which was checked by the skill and the weight of Bob's trained cow horse on the rope. Several times Phil went towards the bay, and every time his advance was met by one of those vicious rushes. Then Phil mounted Curly's horse, and from his hand the loop of another rope fell onto the bay's head. Shortening his rope by coiling it with his rein hand, he maneuvered the trained horse closer and closer to his struggling captive until, with Bob's cooperation on the other side of the fighting animal, he was within safety fixed the leather blindfold over those wicked eyes. When at last hackmore and saddle were in place, the bay stood trembling and sweating. Phil wiped the perspiration from his own forehead and turned to the stranger. "Your horse is ready, sir." End of Part 2.